It sounded like something out of a movie, the kind of unlikely friendship that people would assume was exaggerated if it were written into fiction. On one side, there was a global music icon whose life had been filled with glitter, chaos, and constant reinvention. On the other, a woman who had stepped into one of the most rigid and scrutinized roles in the world. Yet somehow, behind the cameras and beyond the expectations, their paths crossed in a way that neither of them could have predicted. And what followed was far more complicated, emotional, and revealing than the public ever truly understood. For years, the world believed it had a clear picture of their connection. It was often described in polished headlines and carefully worded interviews, shaped into something that felt neat and almost too perfect. But the truth, as it turns out, was far less controlled. It was messy, deeply human, and at times even uncomfortable. And now, looking back, there's a growing sense that what really happened between them was not just a friendship, but a rare kind of bond built on shared isolation, unfiltered honesty, and moments that were never meant to be seen by the public eye. When they first met, there was no grand announcement, no dramatic introduction that signaled the beginning of something historic. It happened in a setting filled with formality, expectations, and unspoken rules. The room was full of people who knew exactly how to behave, how to speak, and how to present themselves. But she didn't quite fit into that mold, not in the way people expected her to. There was something noticeably different about her presence. She didn't carry herself like someone trying to impress the room. Instead, she seemed to observe it, almost as if she was quietly amused by the seriousness of it all. What stood out most wasn't just her appearance or the attention she naturally drew, but the way she made people feel when she spoke to them. There was a warmth that didn't feel rehearsed, a sense that, even in a room full of powerful figures, she was more interested in genuine connection than performance. And that was something he recognized instantly. It was familiar, it was rare, and it was disarming. Their first real interaction didn't follow the expected script. There were no stiff exchanges or formal pleasantries that dragged on endlessly. Instead, there was humor, unexpected, slightly rebellious humor that seemed almost out of place in such a controlled environment. They laughed, quietly at first, then more freely. It was as if, for a moment, they had stepped outside the invisible boundaries that everyone else in the room was carefully respecting. That moment became the foundation of everything that followed, because what they discovered in each other wasn't just shared humor or mutual respect. It was something deeper. They both understood what it felt like to live under constant observation, to have every action analyzed and every word interpreted. They both knew what it meant to be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. As their friendship grew, it became clear that the version of her the world saw was only a fraction of who she really was. In public, she was composed, graceful, and often portrayed as quietly reserved. But in private, she was sharp, witty, and surprisingly fearless in the way she spoke. She noticed everything. She remembered details that others overlooked. And she had a way of telling stories that could turn even the most ordinary moment into something unforgettable. He found that side of her fascinating. It wasn't just entertaining. It was revealing. It showed a person who was constantly navigating two realities at once. One that was expected of her, and one that she guarded carefully, only allowing a select few to see. And with him, she didn't feel the need to maintain that carefully constructed image. She could be candid. She could be unfiltered. She could be herself. There were nights filled with laughter that stretched on longer than planned. Conversations that moved from light-hearted gossip to deeply personal reflections without warning. They would talk about everything, from the absurdities of their public lives to the private struggles they rarely shared with anyone else. And in those moments, there was no hierarchy, no titles, no expectations. Just two people trying to make sense of lives that often felt overwhelming. But what made their connection truly unique was not just the joy they found in each other's company. It was the understanding that didn't need to be explained. They both knew what it meant to feel like outsiders in worlds that demanded perfection. They both carried pressures that most people couldn't fully comprehend. And they both found in each other a sense of relief from that weight. There were also moments that revealed just how powerful her presence could be, even when she wasn't trying. She had an ability to shift the energy of a room without effort. People were drawn to her in ways that went beyond admiration. It was something more instinctive, almost magnetic. And sometimes that attention created situations that were as surprising as they were revealing. At gatherings filled with influential figures and well-known personalities, it wasn't unusual for the atmosphere to change the moment she became engaged in conversation. People noticed, some admired it, others reacted to it in less graceful ways. There were moments of tension, subtle and not so subtle, that unfolded simply because of the attention she received. And yet, she often seemed unaware of the effect she was having. What stood out during those times was how she handled it all. There was no visible effort to control the situation or assert dominance. She remained calm, composed, and entirely herself. It was as if she refused to let the dynamics around her dictate how she behaved. And that, in itself, was a kind of quiet strength that left a lasting impression. Beyond the social gatherings and private jokes, there was a more serious side to their connection. They shared a deep concern for issues that many people at the time preferred to ignore. When fear and misunderstanding were shaping public attitudes, she chose to act with compassion instead. She stepped into spaces that others avoided, showing a level of courage that challenged not just public perception, but also the expectations placed upon her. He saw that courage up close. He witnessed the impact it had, not just on the people she helped, but on the broader conversation that began to shift as a result. It wasn't about making a statement for attention. It was about doing what she believed was right, even when it came with criticism or resistance. And that commitment left a profound mark on him. Their shared efforts during that time created a sense of purpose that went beyond their individual lives. They weren't just navigating fame. They were using it to bring attention to causes that mattered deeply to them. It strengthened their bond in a way that few experiences could. But like any real relationship, theirs was not without conflict. There came a point when misunderstandings began to build, fueled by external pressures and internal frustrations. What seemed like a small disagreement at first gradually turned into something more significant. Words were exchanged, decisions were made, and suddenly, the connection that had once felt unbreakable was strained. The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't just the absence of communication. It was the absence of something that had become an important part of both their lives. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. And with each passing moment, the distance between them grew. Looking back, it becomes clear that the conflict itself was not as important as the pride that kept it unresolved. There were opportunities to reach out, to explain, to apologize, but those moments passed, replaced by hesitation and the influence of voices around them. And in that silence, something valuable was lost. When they finally reconnected, it wasn't because the disagreement had been fully resolved or because everything had been neatly explained. It was because something far more significant reminded them of what truly mattered. A shared loss, sudden and devastating, brought them back into each other's lives. That reunion was emotional, not just because of the circumstances, but because of everything that had gone unsaid for so long. There was an understanding that time had been wasted, that pride had created a distance that didn't need to exist. And in that moment, none of it seemed important anymore. They found their way back to each other, even if only briefly. There were conversations, moments of comfort, and a renewed sense of connection. It felt like the beginning of something restored. But life, as it often does, had other plans. When the news came, it didn't feel real. It couldn't. The idea that someone so full of life, so present, so deeply connected to so many people, could suddenly be gone was impossible to process. The shock was immediate, followed by a wave of grief that seemed to stretch across the world. For him, it was deeply personal. This wasn't just a public figure who had passed away. This was someone he had laughed with, confided in, argued with, and ultimately cared about deeply. And with that loss came a sense of regret that couldn't be undone. The realization that time is fragile, that words left unspoken can never be retrieved. In the aftermath, as the world mourned, he found himself in a position that carried both honor and immense pressure. He was asked to do something that would become one of the most remembered moments in modern history. It wasn't just about performing. It was about capturing a feeling, a farewell, a tribute that millions of people were struggling to express. Standing there, with the weight of that moment pressing down, he understood that this was not about perfection. It was about sincerity, about saying goodbye in a way that felt true to who she was, not just as a public figure, but as a person. The performance became more than just a song. It became a shared moment of grief, a way for people to connect with their emotions in a space where words often fell short. And yet for him, it was also something he carried quietly afterward, not as a triumph, but as a memory tied to loss. In the years that followed, the way he spoke about her began to shift. It became less about the image the world had created and more about the reality he had experienced. He didn't describe perfection. He described complexity. A person who could be kind and strong, but also vulnerable and, at times, conflicted. That honesty is what stands out now. The willingness to acknowledge that the truth is rarely as simple as it appears. That behind every carefully crafted image, there's a real person navigating challenges that are often hidden from view. And perhaps that is the most important part of his confession. Not a dramatic revelation or a shocking secret, but a reminder that what made her extraordinary was not the role she held, but the humanity she never lost. In the end, their story is not just about a friendship between two famous individuals. It is about connection, misunderstanding, forgiveness, and the fragile nature of time. It is about the moments we share, the words we choose, and the ones we leave unsaid. And it leaves behind a quiet question that lingers long after everything else fades. If given the chance, will we choose pride, or will we choose to reach out while we still can?